In 2024, two of the world's largest economies, the United States and Japan, are facing an economic crisis that's reshaping global trade dynamics. Both nations, historically economic powerhouses, are grappling with inflation, mounting debt, and shifting geopolitical tensions that are causing severe strain on their commercial relationships. In this video, we'll take a deep dive into the economic challenges facing the US and Japan, exploring the causes of their growing trade crisis and its impact on the global market. 1. The US economic landscape. In 2024, the US is experiencing a critical period in its economic history. Despite efforts to stabilize after the pandemic, inflation remains a significant issue. The Federal Reserve's interest rate hikes, designed to combat rising prices, are putting a heavy strain on businesses and consumers alike. For American manufacturers, the higher cost of borrowing is limiting investments in new technologies and innovation. The resulting slowdown in economic growth is causing a ripple effect on global supply chains, particularly with trade partners like Japan, a crucial player in the US manufacturing sector. 2. Japan struggles with debt and deflation. Meanwhile, Japan's economy is also facing serious challenges. For decades, Japan has struggled with deflation, and despite recent recovery efforts, the country's national debt is among the highest in the developed world. In 2024, the government's ability to manage its debt and stimulate growth is increasingly in question. Despite Japan's technological advancements and strong industrial base, the combination of stagnant wages, an aging population, and low consumer spending is hindering its recovery. 3. The trade relationship between the US and Japan. Historically, Japan and the US have been key trade partners. Japan is one of the largest holders of US debt, but that relationship is now under strain. With the US focusing on economic isolationism and prioritizing local production, particularly with the America First policies, the bilateral trade between the two nations is under pressure. This shift has resulted in increased tariffs, trade restrictions, and a rethinking of supply chains, particularly in industries like automotive and electronics. Japan's export-driven economy has been particularly vulnerable to these changes, and the country's export numbers have stagnated. Japanese companies, especially those in high-tech sectors like semiconductors, have been hurt by US sanctions and the shift towards protecting domestic industries. 4. The role of technology and innovation in the trade crisis. One of the most crucial sectors affected by the trade crisis is technology. The US and Japan are leaders in semiconductor production, but trade tensions and rising costs are leading to a global shortage of chips. This shortage is crippling industries from automotive to consumer electronics, and both nations are scrambling to find ways to stabilize supply chains and bring manufacturing back to their respective countries. In addition, the rising focus on data security and intellectual property protection has resulted in increased barriers for tech companies trying to expand internationally. Japan's investment in cutting-edge robotics and AI technologies faces significant barriers due to these trade restrictions, leading to a slowdown in the country's technological advancement. 5. Inflation and consumer behavior. Both the US and Japan are dealing with rising inflation. In the US, this has led to a reduction in consumer spending as Americans face higher prices for everyday goods. This affects not just the domestic market but international trade partners like Japan. Similarly, in Japan, inflation is pushing up costs on imported goods, but stagnant wages mean that Japanese consumers are less able to absorb these costs. This economic squeeze is resulting in a significant decrease in demand for luxury goods and high-tech products, which are key export categories for Japan. For the US, rising inflation is cutting into the purchasing power of American consumers, further reducing demand for imported goods, especially high-end Japanese electronics and vehicles. 6. The impact of globalization and supply chain shifts. One of the most significant consequences of the trade crisis between the US and Japan is the effect on global supply chains. Both nations have been central to the global flow of goods, but with their economies under stress, companies are rethinking their supply chain strategies. Many businesses are considering relocating production to more stable or lower-cost countries, creating uncertainty in international trade and the manufacturing sector. For Japan, the shift away from global production has led to an increase in supply chain disruption. Many of its key manufacturers are struggling to meet international demand, and as a result, the global marketplace is starting to see a shift in production hubs, particularly for electronics and automotive industries. 7. The geopolitical factor. Geopolitical tensions, particularly between China, the US, and Japan, are also playing a role in the trade crisis. The US-China rivalry has intensified, and Japan, as a close US ally, is caught in the middle. Japan's trade policies are being influenced by its relationship with both the US and China, complicating its ability to balance its commercial interests. Japan's need to align itself with US interests in terms of security and technology is becoming increasingly complex, as the US pushes for tighter controls on technology exports to China. 8. The way forward. The trade crisis between the US and Japan doesn't have a simple solution. Both nations must find ways to strengthen their economies while dealing with internal economic pressures. Japan's efforts to revitalize its economy with new technology and a reformed labor market could help, but these initiatives require significant investment and time. The US may need to reconsider its protectionist stance and find ways to open up trade, especially in sectors critical to both economies. The future of global trade depends largely on the ability of the US and Japan to manage their economic challenges and repair their trade relationships. As both countries face mounting pressure, their actions will have far-reaching consequences for global markets. Conclusion: in 2024, the trade crisis between the US and Japan is a critical issue that is influencing not just their own economies, but the global market as a whole. The shifting dynamics in technology, inflation, and geopolitical tensions are all playing a part in this crisis. To navigate these turbulent waters, both nations will need to collaborate, innovate, and adapt to the changing global landscape. Stay tuned for more in-depth analyses of global economic trends and the ongoing impact of the US-Japan trade crisis on the global economy.